Texas Senate District 27. Lines are open at 956-224-9082 to give your thoughts on anything on the show tonight, and also later to speak with Sarah Stapleton Barrera when she comes on the line. Sarah Stapleton Barrera, of course, is running to represent Texas Senate District 27. That's the area on the map right there. So it's most of the valley, and I know Edinburgh's not in there, but it's most of the valley. It includes Kingsville. Right under Corpus Christi it stops. And this is the Senate district that we're going to be voting on July the 14th. July the 14th is the day we choose the person who is going to represent us there. Now, and we'll mention this again during the show, but for those of you who are thinking, well, I don't have time or I'm not registered to vote, you have 10 days. So you have 10 days to register to vote still at the Texas Secretary of State website. We'll put that up on a blog post as well, a link to that. You're going to get an application by mail, fill it out, send it back, and you're going to be able to vote on July the 14th for who's going to represent us for Texas Senate District 27. Now, this is, it's the Texas Senate. They go up and they do all kinds of laws and around everything in our area for the next 4 years. And tonight, I wanted to talk a little bit about who the person who is the current representative, Eddie Lucio Jr. We're going to talk about his greatest hits, his voting record, so that we can familiarize ourselves with what has been going on since he's been in office since 1991. It's 29 years, going on 30 years now. And if he is elected again, we're talking about going to 35. So almost 4 decades if he is elected again. Now, to be fair, we're going to go down his voting record to see what he has done in this region. And of course, this is all stuff that's already happened. So we don't need to speculate about how he would be in office. We know. And we're going to talk about Eddie Lucio Jr.'s greatest hits on his voting record tonight. And first up is his voting record on immigration. And seeing a lot of hellos on the Facebook Live. Hello to everybody out there in the Rio Grande Valley. So Eddie Lucio's greatest hits on immigration from the past couple of decades that he's been in office. We just talked about the Immigrant Detention Center in Raymondville, and we touched upon some of the topics of why it's so relevant today. But you guys already know this facility. It's an immigrant detention facility in Raymondville. You've seen it on national news because it became notorious for filthy conditions, for maggot-infested food. It was all over the news, everywhere. And there's still stories like this coming out about immigration detention centers all over the country. Most recently, we saw one coming out of, I believe, California, where immigrants are actually being sprayed with chemical cleaners that are making them sick. And this is still happening now. But these detention centers, obviously, terrible detention centers. But here's what Eddie Lucio did as a senator. One of his greatest hits as a senator. He voted in favor of spending $800 million, first of all, to militarize the whole border in 2015. So there's almost $1 billion to militarize the border. So there's a lot of stuff in that bill. Military equipment, everything. Places, equipment, the whole deal. Jobs, everything. So $800 million. Now, like we said before, this is money that could have been spent on something else. So your kids who go to a school that needs more supplies, it's a great example of where this money could have gone. Communities that don't have internet. Rural communities around the valley that do not have internet. Kids go to school, they come home, they don't have internet at home. It's $1 billion. What could we have built with $1 billion instead of a military presence on the border that now only serves to cage people, and we're just paying to have them cage, separate the families, cage the children, cage the people. Now they're spraying them with cleaner. We're paying for all this. That's money we don't get. And then why? Why are we paying $800 million? This man said, let's spend $800 million to do all this. I don't think that the kids that are in the detention centers were doing anything violent or criminal before they were there. And I think we can all agree on that. But to go back to the detention center in Raymondville, here is the sweetest plum, as they say, of this greatest hits of Eddie Lucio. Eddie Lucio in 2003 and 2014 actually, and as a senator, worked. He was paid as a consultant by a for-profit prison corporation to build the 2,000-bed immigration detention center in Raymondville, Texas. Now, for those of you who may not be super familiar with this process, this is a private company, right? They build jails and they manage jails and they make money from this. The government pays them to do that. That's how the private business works. But it's not easy to just build a new complex because it needs to be filled with people. You need the laws to change to say, okay, well, now these people go in there on this new law. Now we separate families, right? Now we detain, now we hold. And so these businesses need somebody to organize all of this change, all of this structural, political, policy change to bring about these contracts that they are then awarded. And this is how they make money. In this case, Eddie Lucio Jr. was in the middle of the whole song and dance, and he was paid. He was paid by this private company to help organize this government contract for the jail, and that is the Immigrant Detention Center in Raymondville. So one of the top hits of Eddie Lucio Jr.'s representation on Texas Senate District 27. Everything to do with what's going on in the country today, and we're gonna keep talking about this. We're gonna talk about it tonight, but we're gonna keep talking about this. And again, we have a vote coming up July the 14th. Protesting, that's a right. Voting, that's a right that we have. Democratic right, democratic responsibility. So that's happening on July 14th. So for everybody who's organizing right now, all of you, voting is also a very important part of the democratic process. Let's move on to another greatest hit by Eddie Lucio Jr. Let's talk about something recent, COVID-19, his response to COVID-19. Now, apparently from what I researched, this is the guy who was responsible for working with Governor Abbott to bring down testing sites and so forth. To give you a little bit of background on this, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but this community that he represents, the Rio Grande Valley, is a community which people have described as high risk to something like COVID-19, and that is for several different reasons. Number one, many people here are not as insured as people in other areas. So, high-risk community, not as much health insurance as other places. Also, people here earn less money, and they have less resources to social distance by staying home. There's less jobs that can be done from home. And so, also, we have high rates of conditions like diabetes and heart disease. So we have all these three or more pillars of high risk to something like COVID-19 in this particular community. However, let's see. I think we're having a little bit of problem with the connection going in and out. Very sorry about that. I'm actually in one of these rural areas that needs better internet. So I have a cheap satellite internet that's available to people in rural areas. Some people, not everybody. Just so happens to be in a little section of the map where I can catch some signal from a tower near here. But definitely I'm not on broadband, so thank you for your patience with this connection sometimes. But on COVID-19, as I was saying, RGV high-risk community. On March 4th, let's look at a timeline of this. March 4th, we saw the first cases in Texas. Eddie Lucio hadn't talked about it yet, hadn't brought it up yet. 9 days later, Donald Trump declares a national emergency. Still nothing. March 13th, right? 6 days later, on March the 19th, which is, at the end of the month now. So at the beginning of the month, we're seeing first cases in Texas. All the way almost to the end of the month, Lucio finally writes to Governor Abbott, at this point urging him to allocate resources for the Rio Grande Valley. So very late on getting testing down here, and this man is wise. So this is another of his greatest hits. And just to add to the whole thing, he did not urge for any kind of cancellations. The cancellations that occurred at South Powder Island, Stock Show, those things initially, if you all remember, came down from the county judges, those initial closings. So he did not take a look at that. It's very hands-off, and we needed him greatly to bring down those testing sites much earlier, to bring down those resources much earlier. And as you all saw, yesterday was the highest record-breaking day of daily COVID infections in the Rio Grande Valley ever. And by a large margin. I'm going to be watching the numbers that come out today. We had a report, it's on our website now, of that, where I spoke to Ronnie Garza, who maintains a website showing data from all 4 counties. So far, we have been climbing up slowly. It looks now that because of the closings, this is going to accelerate much faster. Could we have flattened the curve even more had Eddie Lucio acted sooner, maybe a month sooner? The science says absolutely. Science says yes, especially for a community as vulnerable as ours. And then we're going to see, and we're also going to keep tracking the COVID numbers in the Rio Grande Valley, taking a look at some of that. So that's the second greatest hit that we are talking about tonight, Eddie Lucio Jr.'s voting record. So we're going to have Sarah Stapleton Barrera, who is running for Texas Senate District 27 at 9 o'clock. She's going to be videoing in, and lines are open, 956-224-9082 now, and for that interview later as well. I want to talk about at least 2 more, and I've got a long list here. But we've got about 15 minutes left. I want to talk about two more greatest hits by Eddie Lucio Jr., the guy who represents us at the Capitol right now, on education. Okay? Education. So this is going to be about private schools, charter schools. And many of you may not be super familiar with this. Everybody who has kids in school probably is very familiar with this, because it's been a while since, as a state and as a region, we were sold on the idea that we should take money from public schools, and put it into these private schools, or partially privately owned schools, religious schools, taking all that public money from the public schools and concentrating it into these private schools. So Lucio voted twice for, let's talk about this, private school voucher scholarship in 2015-2017 legislative sessions that would divert state franchise tax dollars away from the state budget and use them to subsidize private and religious schools. So that's a fancy way of saying what I just said. Take money from public schools, put it into private and religious schools. He voted for this. In 2015, he said yes. In 2017, he said yes. He made that possible. When the school choice measure, okay, which is a legislation which provided tax credit for businesses that donate money to fund these private schools. Okay, so not just taking money from public schools, but in effect taking tax money from everybody, because now we're saying, okay, if you're a business, usually you pay taxes, and those taxes pay for everything in the state. Now, if you donate some money to these private schools, you don't have to pay those taxes anymore. Right? So that's double punch, because the taxes get taken away from the public school system, and then we get taxes taken away just in general that businesses would usually pay. They don't have to pay them anymore. So he's diverting all this public money, to these private schools. Now, we spent a lot of time debating these charter schools, debating these vouchers, debating whether this money should go into them. And it's been a while. This is not a new issue. But what is new is what is happening at some of these private schools. IDEA, for example, in the Rio Grande Valley. Just a few weeks ago, the CEO of IDEA, which receives a lot of public funds, this is your money that you pay, taxes, IDEA School. The CEO of IDEA School, basically, something came out in the press that this guy was spending millions of dollars on private jet flights, sports tickets, all kinds, ridiculous stuff that you don't need to run, a school district in Westaco, a school district in McAllen, flying around on a private jet, getting, I think it was LA Lakers, like a whole season of tickets for LA Lakers, millions of dollars, many different things. So, comes out in the news, otherwise we would not have known. But this guy resigned, right? He put in his resignation and left, which basically means you get fired. But he's the CEO of this big thing. So he resigns, basically fired. Now, it was reported just about a week ago that after the fact that he was found to be doing this, the organization was doing this with other expenses as well, and he's leaving, resigning, basically getting fired. He is walking away with $900,000. Now, this is not money for work that he's doing. He went home a long time ago. This guy went home. They sent him home. He doesn't work for IDEA anymore. He's not the CEO of IDEA anymore, but IDEA says, here's a check for $900,000. By the way, on your way out, here's $1 million on your way out of partially public funds. And this is the result of another greatest hits by Eddie Lucio Jr. in Texas Senate District 27. So very interesting results. And you guys can take this voting record. You can look at it. Unfortunately, a lot of media in the region doesn't really talk about his record this way. And in fact, in my search, and somebody maybe from Rio Grande Guardian can call me and explain this to me. I have no idea. But in my research for this, what I saw on some of these, supposedly independent journalism websites is I think Rio Grande Guardian just prints letters that Eddie Lucio Jr. sends in. Right? And I just saw that. Like, it's not even, they didn't even write a story about what was going on or anything. They just printed the thing that he sent in. Which, to be fair, of course, many newspapers will print, a letter to the paper. Everybody does that. Politicians, the whole thing. In this case, if you go back through the archives, it's a little bit of a gray area, some of the stuff that's being published there. And this stuff does get written about, but unfortunately, we do have that sort of treatment of Eddie Lucio Jr. in the media, in the local press, where I think the last one was for Memorial Day, right? So he wrote a letter for Memorial Day saying some words that to the people who are looking at his voting record may not sound as authentic as they would be had he actually done some better things for the community, right? But Rio Grande Guardian, again, just posting it up. And it may be that, to single them out is not necessarily what I want to do. There may be other publications that do that with Eddie Lucio Jr. and with a lot of other different politicians. I've seen that before. But the last greatest hit and maybe we'll have room for one more that I want to talk about. Something from last year and years before, actually, is Senate Bill 6, which many people have heard as, quote, the bathroom bill. So basically, this bill prohibits transgender-friendly bathroom policies in public schools and universities and in government buildings. So everybody's heard about this. We heard about it when it was really big in the news, right? People wanted to have transgender-friendly bathrooms in these government offices. And Senate Bill 6 in Texas said, no, can't do that. Can't do it. And so this is really it's about a lot of things, but for a lot of people close to the Republican side, at least, for some people on the Democratic side, this was about a separation of church and state. So what that means basically is that the government, because of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, right, we cannot discriminate people based on their sexual orientation, on their gender, their race, religion. I mean, look at what's happening right now. This is very relevant to that. The state can't do that. No, really, nobody's supposed to be doing that, right? But this particular bill was just about government buildings. But that's really that was really the point, right? Is that in the government, we respect everybody, regardless of age, race, sexual orientation, gender, But Lucio said no, not for transgender people. And he gave a quote. He said, quote, I don't believe in separation of church and state. I don't believe in separation of church and state. Everything that I do, I look at it as an act of faith that I have for all people, which is really a confusing statement. To take his statement, everything that I do, I looked at as an act of faith, of moral obligation that I have for all people, to take that quote and superimpose it on the photos of these immigrants in this, what some people have called concentration camps. And we're going to start waking up to these realities in the valley. What some people have called concentration camps here. And you can look at some of these images and you can look at some of these stories. And it is not easy to deny that that term could be used. But this man took private money to organize this, use our money that we put in his hands to make this possible. And he says, everything that I do is an act of faith, of moral obligation that I have for all people. So it doesn't ring true. And if that doesn't ring true, then Senator Lucio voted against transgender rights for a totally different reason. I think it absolutely logical. What reason could that be? Of course, many people have said that it is straight up discrimination. And in the coming weeks, we want to keep the conversation going about Black Lives Matter. We want to round out that conversation with what is happening here in our own region, the structure of law enforcement, the structure of policy with people like Eddie Lucio Jr., the racism and colorism attitudes that we have here in this region that also makes it very dangerous to even stand on a street corner and say that people have a right not to die at the hands of police. We're going to be talking about this over the next coming week. weeks. And obviously, we don't want to have that conversation die down.